A very good evening and welcome to Tuesday Talk for Tuesday, the 2nd of September. I'm David Abdullah. I'm going to be moderating this evening. We're going to have a very important and interesting discussion. And this is MSJ's contribution to our independence. Trinidad and Tobago, of course, celebrated our 63rd anniversary of Independence on Sunday, August 31st. And Jamaica commemorated its 63rd anniversary on the 6th of August. And so we need to take a look at our independence experience over the last 6 decades. What have we achieved? And particularly look at the issue of decolonization. And we have no better person to discuss this than Professor Brian Meeks, who is a Jamaican, but with very important Trinidadian roots. His mother was Trinidadian, and his grandfather, very involved in politics in Trinidad, was a former mayor of Port of Spain, Dr. Tito Achong. So Brian is Trinidadian as well as Jamaican in that sense, very much a Caribbean person. And studied at UWI St. Augustine, where he did his first degree. That's when I first met him, when I started at St. Augustine in 72. He was ahead of me. And so we were all together in student politics, Students United Front, when I contested the treasurer position on the Students' Guild in February of 73 and won that election. And then Brian went to do his master's at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And when I was president of the Guild, I went to Mona for university meetings, and Brian was, of course, on campus and had a little motorbike which he moved around. And I was on the back of it as a pillion rider. Not a very good pillion rider, actually, because although I used to, I'd like to drive fast, I was not that comfortable on a motorbike.
But you're still here, David.
Sorry?
But you're still here.
I'm still very much here, Brian, yes. Testimony to your excellent bike riding. And those days, of course, helmets were not mandatory. But we never had an accident. And I should also point out that Brian's mother, Achong, was the first young woman to win an island scholarship in Trinidad and Tobago from St. Joseph Convent. So very much, Trini roots, and she has a lot of family here. So we're very happy to have Brian. His last book was significantly entitled After the Postcolonial Caribbean, Memory, Imagination, and Hope, an excellent book, which I commend to anybody who can access it. And this conversation, not only in the context of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago achieving or commemorating 63 years of political independence, but also with what is happening in our region, with the United States on a steroid-driven Monroe Doctrine, with Mr. Trump, sending warships into the Southern Caribbean and so on. So there's a lot for us to discuss. And so welcome, Brian, and thanks for accepting the invitation to be on Tuesday Talk this evening.
Thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here. And as I told you when you asked me, I could not say no. So I'm very happy to be here for many reasons, including the fact that you are the host, but also because it's originating in Trinidad, of which I am obviously very fond of the country and the nation. So thank you.
Thanks. And Brian, of course, is an academic, former director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Center of Social and Economic Studies, Institute of Social Economic Studies, currently professor of Africana Studies at Brown University. But he has been a political activist as well in Jamaica and was also in Grenada during the days of the revolution. So very involved in political activism, and when at Mona, hosted together with another Jamaican friend and colleague, Professor Anthony Bogues. Very important seminar series on Caribbean reasonings, which I attended, I think, two. One in tribute to Richard Hart and one on the Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago. But there were several other very important ones, and the proceedings of those were published, and therefore Brian was able to also collaborate with us in Trinidad on some important conferences here. The centennial of CLR James in 2001, and also George Padmore conference at UWI, and I was part of that with ODBQ. So we've had a lot of important collaborations which linked the campus to the ground, to activism, and that is why this discussion is so important. So Brian, 63 years after independence, the Trinidadian Calypsonian who died some years ago, some months ago, Funny, sang for independence on one of our independence anniversaries. How you feel? How do you feel, Brian, about our status? You know, have we achieved beyond the flag and the anthem and a certain sense of identity? You know, I was at cricket yesterday. Everybody was wearing red to support TKR, Trinidad Night Riders. I was on Repeat Avenue, which you know well, listening to Pan on Sunday night. Thousands of people were there. So there was a sense of identity. But is that sufficient? Have we achieved more than that?
I have mixed feelings, David, very mixed feelings. And I'm glad you started with the crowds on Ariapita Avenue. And we can think of similar crowds in Jamaica around independence, around important moments. There's a positive side to the years since the end of colonialism that has to do with our self-recognition and our coming into our own as a people. And I want to put air quotes around a people, because I have serious problems with nationalism in the way it has been written to us. We've accepted it as the form within which our people are manifest. But I think our people go beyond the bounds of Trinidadian nationalism or Jamaican nationalism, for that matter. And we need to think of our people in a wider way. But for the time being, let us live within the flag-given, I was about to say God-given, but the flag-given bounds. And there are ways in which that whole question of self-recognition is an important one. If you think about our system of replacing governments, it is flawed, and it is significantly flawed. But it has allowed, under severe stress and with many caveats, to allow for the replacement of governments. And when you compare that with countries that have maintained dictatorial forms over very long periods of time, or even more significantly flawed electoral systems, I would put that down as a positive. And the other thing that we have to put down, it's a low bar, but that we haven't collapsed. We haven't descended into the common parlance of the failed state for the most part. We're still there functioning. When you no longer have a functioning government, and it is impossible to move from point A to point B without fear of your life, then I would consider that a failed state. And there are very few instances in the Anglophone Caribbean, certainly. We can talk about Haiti. Haiti is an important lesson to talk about, in which we are approaching the gates of the failed state. But after we make those initial remarks and we begin to dig down into the statistics, and there are so many issues in the world in which Caribbean states, and particularly Anglo-Caribbean states, are in the top 10, and it's not good things. It's, for example, like we're in the top 10 in the number of suicides. We're in the top 10 in the number of murders. There is a whole range of questions in which we have just not been able to convert, or corruption is a third, which we're in the top 10 in the world, different Caribbean countries, and I won't go into the listing here, but we appear in these statistics regularly. We're in the top 10 in terms of, and many of us are in that top 20 or so in terms of the export of our talent. And if we put all of these figures together and we move beyond the bounds of GDP figures and the sort of hard statistics that they give to us, we're not in a good place. We haven't been in a good place for a very long time. And that is why in recent years, in the last decade, when Jamaicans were asked in a number of polls whether they preferred colonialism to independence, a majority voted in favor, polled in favor of colonialism. They don't know what colonialism was, because this is a generation that has grown up after colonialism. But they can't imagine that colonialism could have been worse than the situation that they are in today. The bottom line is that it was worse, that colonialism, that anything we, and to the extent that we have moved beyond the society of colonialism, we need to understand the nature of the colonial enterprise. And the colonial enterprise was a vicious system. It was racially exclusive. It excluded, it was not merit-based. It excluded talent for the most part. It initiated a legislative plunder of these economies. And I'm talking about not the era of slavery. I'm talking about the century after slavery, when laws were put in place that prevented us developing certain kinds of industries because those belonged to the colonial power, to the British colonial power. And there was general atrophy of the society. And at the bottom, deep poverty. So, if you read the novels, the few novels that were produced out of the 1930s and the 1940s, Du Boisier, C.L.R. James, Roger Mays in Jamaica, and you read into them, you get the full sort of bandwidth of the poverty that existed just below the surface. And that was a critical part of the colonial enterprise. So those of us who imagine that colonialism could have been better did not understand what colonialism was and why there was this society-wide and growing dissatisfaction with the colonial enterprise. I should stick a pin there and say that there was a competing hegemony of ideas between, on the one hand, a complete distaste for the colonial enterprise and a belief by many that the empire, the British Empire, was somehow above the actual reality of the colonial enterprise. And only if it knew better, things would be better. So there was, if the truth be told, in the period after slavery, in particular in the early period between the 1860s and the beginning of the 19th century, imperial romanticism existed. But alongside it was a deep, deep dissatisfaction with the racial and administrative abuses of the colonial system and what I call legislative plunder, which was the taking away of the resources of the country and the prevention of the country from moving its economy beyond that of the export of primary producing products for the benefit of empire. So we have made some positive steps. We are not in the position we were in in the 1930s and through to the 1950s. But the state of the Caribbean is a state of malaise. It is a state in which many people struggle for survival. Many more people are doing their best to do to make the best out of the situation. Many other people just want a visa or a passport and a place to go to because they don't see success within the space in which they were born and have lived for most of their lives. So I have to say, mixed feelings. We have postponed the kind of deep therapeutic rethinking that is necessary for us to do. In 2012, at the time of the 50th anniversary, we held a series of reasonings again in Jamaica that we call 50-50, critical reflections in a time of uncertainty, in which we reflected not just on Jamaica, but also on Trinidad, because both of us attained the 50th independence in the same year. And at that time, it was clear to me then, and that is now a full 13 years ago. 13 years ago? No, what am I?
Yes.
13 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
That there's a deep dissatisfaction. There's a deep uncertainty as to what the enterprise is all about, as to what the state is all about. I would say I draw a distinction between the nation and the state, right? People celebrate their community. They celebrate their oneness as a people. And in the island space, that oneness might be Trinidad. In the island space, that oneness might be Jamaica. But I think they're both celebrating themselves as a people. I mean, collectively, we are people who have passed through, in effect, the gates of hell, and we've emerged on the other side alive and still kicking. And I think there is something resilient and necessary in that celebration. But in terms of celebrating the state of Jamaica, which I can speak of, perhaps more frankly and in a forward way, or the state of Trinidad, that's a whole different thing. The state, the apparatus, the mechanisms that are deeply problematic in many respects. The mechanisms of the security forces, the mechanisms of the bureaucracy, the way in which the governmental system does or does not distribute benefits, the problematic insertion of these states into world affairs as junior partners. There are all sorts of issues which are cause for concern, even as, people wave the flag and say, Trinity to the bone. Well, what does Trinity to the bone mean? It means that I'm part of a community which is celebrating itself in its richness, its history of language, of interactions, of music, of a lifestyle, which is unmatched in its celebration of life. And that, I think, has to be distinguished from the state. So I suspect we don't so much celebrate the nation state as we celebrate a concept of the people. And then on the other hand, we look on the state with a deep skepticism, because it just hasn't done what it was supposed to do or what we imagined it could do. And in many respects, it's become corrupt. Individuals are corrupt. Sometimes the entire system is corrupt. People see that, but it's what we have, and they can't do better. So they either try their best to operate within it or leave. at moments resist actively, but in moments of in between those moments of active resistance, in moments of despair, leave. And so without ending up on a note of pessimism, and we haven't hopefully reached that point. You remember my book ends with hope, right?
Yes.
The last word is hope. And so I am the eternal optimist. Optimism is my religion, right? I believe that these people of ours, these Caribbean people of ours, have seen too much, have been through too much to ever be written off of any scenario of progress and improvement, right? When it doesn't happen through the state, then we try to do it through our family networks. So the state has failed us, and so one person goes to live in New York and works on 3 jobs and sends back resources, and then another family member comes up to Brooklyn, and they make their way in various ways, and then the children of those family members end up at the university at which I teach, Brown University, as undergraduates, and then move on into all other spheres of life. And so what we have done is through a process of finding a way to survive. We have managed to survive. But frankly, the states have done a poor job. And the nation and the people in themselves can only do so much. And we have to begin to think of new ways to recapture the possibilities and expectations that many placed in that original moment of independence. And we can talk about that as well, because remember, the moment of independence wasn't supposed to come that way, right? We had planned to. There was this federation, which had been the way of going into independence as a group, which would at least have provided us with a slightly larger demographic, but more so would have incorporated the common people of the Caribbean in a more integral way. And that collapsed for reasons which we can't elaborate in great detail here. But the island independence was not preordained. In fact, up until the late 1950s, early 1960s, we still could not imagine it, right? It had to be together that we could move forward. And then all of a sudden it was. And looking back 63 years later, it seems as though, there was no preordained plan, even less so with the smaller islands of the Eastern Caribbean. It was thought that it was impossible that those islands, I'm talking about Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Nevis, etc. It was thought that it was impossible for those islands to survive on their own. Okay, so they have survived. And so that in itself is a miracle. But it's a default situation. We run up a flag, we call it a nation, and all of a sudden we're celebrating nationhood. We need to think what that is and exactly what that means. Sorry about that. Yeah. So flag independence, and you were the one who used the term, which is absolutely correct. And the very notion of island independence is one that was created and not preordained. It wasn't written in the Bible that the island of Trinidad would operate as an independent bumper car maneuvering through the world of the 20th century, or that Jamaica, which is just marginally bigger than Trinidad, could operate like a one-man show, against the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union, etc. And we could just do it by ourselves. Up until the very end, the view was that we would have to do this thing together, and even together would be a stretch. But at least together, then we could find a way to pool resources, pool talent, operate in a sort of more consolidated way in the rest of the world. And that collapsed. So, I mean, one of the things we need to re-examine is this concept, that appears now to be written in stone, that the nation state is the only way that we can conceive the world. And it sounds like, well, what else, right? One of the things is a confederation of states that share a variety of different facilities that allow for movement in a far more flexible and open way. We're seeing some of that, for example, in the Eastern Caribbean states and some of their new approaches to movement, which is a step in the right direction. The entire question of state boundaries, which frankly is given to us and we accept, are questions that I think we need to re-examine. We need to begin to think of ourselves as rich historical, cultural entities, which need to find ways to eliminate the artificial barriers, and to consider ourselves as one region and beyond regions. So I mean, there are new initiatives which are being made with Africa. There are, of course, initiatives that are being made with South America. If you think about ALBA, if you think about Brazil at this moment, and possibly. So I mean, in a sense, there's nothing that I'm saying that is absolutely new, but what I'm trying to introduce is thinking beyond the nation state. If you think of the nation state as a moment in history, we are already beyond it. We just don't have the structures and the words to explain what that looks like. But we are already beyond the nation state. And the question is, what kind of world exists? If there was a time within memory, within some maybe marginally living memory still, there was no third world nation state, except for Ethiopia, right? Except for maybe Liberia for a moment, except for Haiti. And then all of a sudden, there are all of these nation states. Is it conceivable that there could be a point when nation states are no longer the sort of framework for understanding human relations and how we understand our interaction with other human beings? So that's one of the things I want to think about.
Right. Thanks, Brian. That's a very expansive description of where we have come from and some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges that we face and some ideas of going forward. I just want to back up a little bit, because you talked about, that generation of the 30s, C.L.R. James and others, Alfred Menz and others who were writing novels, Roger Mays in Jamaica writing novels in the 30s and describing the conditions of our society at that time. But what was also significant, it goes back to, say, J.J. Thomas, who wrote at the turn of the century. There was an affirmation, there were others, but there was an affirmation about ourselves in response to the colonial narrative that you described of racism, that we're inferior, and so on and so on. C.L.R. James, Every Cook Could Govern, for example, J.J. Thomas writing a counter narrative to the English Professor so-called Freud, who said that we are mentally and inferior to the Europeans, white Europeans, and that kind of thing, and therefore incapable of being in charge of our own affairs. And of course, CLR writing about every cook could govern. So there was, you're right, there was this counter narrative, but there was also a strong sense of affirmation. So there were these stories about our parents' generation going abroad to study. My dad would have known your mom and so on. He's a bit of 2 years older, but would have known your mom and so on at probably the Rocky School of Music on Carter Street in Woodbrook. When they went away, they did not accept racism in the United States. And of course, many who left and went to England didn't accept the racism there. They fought against it, including Shaka Hislop's father, who incidentally passed away recently, and fought a major case in England with people like Darcus Howe and others, again, James Millett and others, against racism in England. So we had that sense of confidence as a people that we can and will make our way independently. And yes, you're right, it wasn't island independence, it was as a federation. I remember Lennox Pear always saying that when he was younger, he never saw himself as a Trinidadian. He always called himself a West Indian, right? And I'm sure the same is true for many of that generation and just afterwards. But there was also a certain vision, even after the Federation collapsed, there was also a certain vision of the professional classes at the time of a capacity to govern our own countries. And before them, there was the labor movement of the 20s and 30s and 40s that really fought for independence, self-government, federation, but a different kind of federation to that which was created, federation with a strong central government and with independence. I remember there was a slogan coming out of one of the conferences: no adult franchise without self-government, no self-government without federation. So there was a tie between democracy, which is adult franchise, and independence or self-government, and federation, because they were seen to be completely tied up as one. And of course, that labor agenda then got superseded later on. But there was at least that generation, the Norman Manleys, Eric Williams, and they had their weaknesses and limitations, which we're not going to discuss now, and others who gave us a sense of vision. But then something went badly wrong, I think, after that. And I know in your book you have explored the experiences, we can't discuss them in great detail, but the experiences of Jamaica, democratic socialism under Manley, as an attempt to further the independence project. Grenada, of course, Maurice Bishop, and you lived there for a period, and trying to assert, Grenada as a sovereign nation with a different path of development, and Guyana for a period, perhaps under Burnham in the early period, until he went askew. So there were those experiences that didn't result, and of course that was state power, and those experiences of state power did not succeed in sustaining a better life for all of our people. They might have.
Let me interrupt you for a second, please. Don't lose your train of thought. But I do think that we have to consider a transition which takes place and to try to understand it from the radical anti-colonial labor-driven movements that take us up to the late 1930s and the rebellions in the Caribbean, which were either led by them or, in a sense, sometimes the rebellions emerge even despite the labor movement in a kind of way. I'm thinking of in Trinidad is a classic example of that movement with an increasing autonomy and audacity of action, independent of the middle classes in many respects, and militant, really trying to shake things up and make a different world, very much influenced by events happening in the wider world. The Soviet Union in a period when it was still considered to be a place where workers could get a good deal. And even when that was not the consideration, when the Soviet Union defended the rights of nations to self-determination, there was that side of the equation which was seen as positive. So there's this movement which up until the 1930s, up until 37 in Trinidad, 38 in Jamaica, is really cresting. And then if you move into the 1940s and 1950s, there's a moderation, right? You get the emergence of a more quote unquote, again, big air quotes, responsible leadership. You get a lot of the labor-oriented efforts of the earlier period being either tamped down or incorporated into a move towards responsible government. And I know there are many more strokes of the brush to be drawn here, because in some instances, those, and particularly in Trinidad, the independent trend, the trend of independent trade unionism and worker action continues alive. In other countries, it continues, but it more incorporated into the national effort. And of course, and at the same time that this is happening, we're moving into the Cold War. And the Cold War is setting a framework as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable coming from the West. So therefore, there's an immense struggle to remove the sort of more radical leaders or to marginalize them. And we think of the Butlers, and we think of the left wing in Trinidad, and we think of the 4-H's in Jamaica. We think of similar people in Guyana who remain hanging on for a time until in two movements in 53 and 63. Any attempt of an independent political and labor movement is broken or divided into racial contingents. So what you have is a movement for change, which, had that movement maintained its momentum, would have led to a different kind of independence than the independence which came in 1962. Now, at this point, I'm not laying blame on any single man, whether it be Williams or Manley or even Bustamante, right? And there's a lot of blame to be laid all around. But I'm saying that if we see the sweep of history, then we see the blunting of a radical anti-colonial movement that really wanted to shake things up from the roots, and its replacement with movements which accommodated themselves to the West. And this is important, because the accommodation with the West is what happens next is going to happen next, right? Which is the accommodation with the West gives us a decade after independence that was literally wasted, right? This, by the way, in 1965, Kwame Nkrumah wrote Neocolonialism, the highest stage of imperialism, right? Which essentially, coming from Ghana, which was really our vanguard in terms of the Commonwealth, and certainly the Black Commonwealth countries, trying to seek an independent road. And that was crushed. But Nkrumah understood that when the British and the Americans, by extension, realized that they can't stop independence after the war, then everything was pushed in the direction of compromising independence, either by force, by coercion, and in some instances, people were quite happy to say Bustamante jumped up and said, "Where are we the West?" Right? Without, you don't negotiate like that, right? You don't give away your hand in the first round, And the day of independence, he's telling President Kennedy, we are with you guys. No, be standoffish, negotiate, get a better deal, But these guys, and of course, Williams is not Bustamante, they're not the same person. And neither of the two are Manley. Manley wasn't in power anyway. But betwixt and between, what we end up doing is incorporating ourselves lock, stock, and barrel into a system which they left us with, and which ends up with a decade of screwdriver industries, exporting bauxite, giving away our bauxite in Jamaica, with not too much elaboration in the oil fields in Grenada, in Trinidad, beyond just pumping it out of the ground. And all of this is why there's Black Power in 1970, why there's Rodney in 1968, right? And ultimately why there's Grenada in 1983, but that's a slight 1979, the start of the revolution. Yeah. But and of course Grenada is delayed because Grenada's 57 was in 1951.
Independence was 73.
Their independence was 73, but their
the labor movement was in the 50s.
So they were always a little delayed in terms of the sequence that certainly Jamaica and Trinidad experienced in a more parallel fashion. So in a result, in a sense, then the compromises we made going into independence is what set up the playing field for the Black Power movement of the 1970s, where you and I, David, as students, enter the University of the West Indies and are deeply opposed to the sitting governments because they're not doing anything to really change the game, and all of the racial features of colonialism remain unchecked and unchanged. Which is why there's Black Power in the Caribbean. One of the reasons why there's Black Power in the Caribbean. And so we gain independence, but we gain a compromise independence. There's the Black Power movement. There is, in the Jamaican case, there is Michael Manley, who comes to power, the sort of scion of the old Fabian Socialist PNP, but who adopts the mannerisms of the Black Power movement and actually pushes society to do some of the basic things which should have been done a decade at least before the time of independence, and ultimately gets displaced because of doing those things by the regional hegemon, the United States. Trinidad is a little more complicated because Eric Williams remains in power, but he tries to do some of the things that he should have done from the beginning, in the civil service, in building housing for poor people, in trying to diversify the petrochemical industry so that some of the benefits return to Trinidad, which should have been done from long before. So he tries to do some of the changes from the top that had been done, or that this Michael Manley was beginning to do from the bottom, involving the people and so on and so forth. And it carries Trinidad, and that's partly what's, along with the benefits of the oil crisis and the wealth which comes to Trinidad as a result of that, saves Trinidad. And I use saves again, I'm using air quotes a lot, right? But saves Trinidad from a revolutionary crisis in that period. but nonetheless doesn't go far enough to transform Trinidad into something new. It still remains a neo-colony. It still remains a part of the neo-colonial system. Jamaica, after the 1980 elections, is drawn back into the system in the way in which it had tried to escape from it. And Grenada, which is another story, which, for discussion at another time, goes the furthest in attempting to break out of it and collapses in on itself, and is then invaded and returned to the fold of neocolonialism. But the neocolonial system is what we live on. And the system basically says that thou shalt not develop on your own terms. Thou shalt operate on our terms. And these terms limit what you can do, right? Very few countries from the old colonial network have escaped from that system. And those that have, to some degree, I think of South Korea, I think of the so-called East Asian tigers. It's because they're given that latitude because the alternative is the Chinese model, right? So as an alternative to the Chinese model, they actually do some pretty radical things. Radical land reforms in the case of South Korea, that if you look at South Korea's land reforms, they're almost revolutionary. Not a revolutionary government from the top, implementing, but really giving land to the people, carrying out immense social welfare and educational reforms, which allow for the society to move forward at an extremely rapid rate. And they're allowed to do this because the alternative is seen as them going over to a sort of Chinese model of socialist development. So give them the ambit to do certain things to prevent them from losing them altogether.
Yeah. And Brian, excellent. I'm glad you intervened at the point you did. And so I just want to add one more point in terms of the historical narrative, which is the last, say, 15, 20 years. Yes. Jamaica, starting with an earlier point with IMF structural adjustment, what we now call neoliberalism, but our elites, what Lloyd Best called the validating elites, or those who went to university with us, yes, right, and ran the technocracy, ran the state enterprises in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and worked throughout the university, all acquiesced to the neoliberal paradigm of there is no alternative but the free market. Tina, that's right. Margaret Thatcher's favorite term, Tina. There is no alternative to the free market capitalist model, where the rich will get richer and a little bit will trickle down to poor people, and so on, and all the liberalizations, the privatizations of the state enterprise sector, the attacks on the labor movement, and the development of a precariat in terms of workers having insecure work and that kind of thing. All of those things have happened in our countries, and therefore we have become more of a neo-colony now than perhaps we were, say, well, certainly I talk about like Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica in the early 70s.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely true. And the irony of it all is that the neoliberal model, which our friends presented to us as inevitable, and that we were dinosaurs for even questioning it, that this is where the world is and always will be, is now melting in the air. As Karl Marx famously said, all that is solid melts into air, right? And it is melting into air because there is a new game in town, and that is the game of the 21st century quasi-fascists who have little time for the globalist notions of world government and of the Washington Consensus, and are in this game as robber barons of old to get what they can from themselves, devil take the hindmost, right? And therefore, the entire structure of neoliberalism, which involves free trade, world trade is going to be free, provided you abide by our rules, et cetera, is now crumbling in the face of Trump's tariffs, and in the face of unilateral decisions taken by the United States. We're living, of course, in a very frightening moment, but it's a moment between solidary, organized systems of world capitalism in which a new structure of consensus hasn't emerged and is likely not to emerge. So all of us are now running for the exits. I'm talking about all of the very same people you and I know, right? Who run state enterprises, head central banks, do all of these things. Because where are the rules and who can we look to, right? And this is a moment of dissolution. And yes, it is frightening. And yes, I'm not suggesting that I have some answer as to where it is going. But what is certain is that it tells us, don't listen to these people for advice, right?
Yes.
They're looking out for themselves, right? And the Tina advice was just gratuitous words to catch us in a network of belief, right? The questions that we have to think about are our spaces and our people, and where we live and what we need to do to make this a place that is economically better for them, in which their children, our children and grandchildren have a future, and in which a meaningful life in balance with the environment, which is the ultimate question, in balance with the environment, can be made. And we have to go back to those basics that you and I used to sit in Lloyd Best's class on a 6:30 in the morning. I don't know if you had that early morning class. I think
no. By the time I did Caribbean economic problems, he had shifted
yes.
the time.
Yeah, well, ours was at a ridiculous time in the morning, and he used to give us accounting books in which we'd have to do plantation accounts, and I would say, why are we doing this? Well, what he was showing us was that economics was not a game of algebra, right? But it was a game of things, of production, and of people. And the accounting framework would tell you how that worked. And if you could understand that, then you would move beyond the blinding econometrics framework to understand the underlying substance, that this is about people and labor and so on. And Lloyd was never a Marxist, but his
No.
but that framework was very important to me in terms of understanding. And we have to go back to basics, because Tina has failed, right? We're in a new world. The order of that world is not quite clear yet, but we have to look out for ourselves, and we have to find a foundation on which to look out for ourselves. And that's going to require a degree of not of two bright people. It's going to require the society sitting down with itself and discussing, who are we? What do we want of this life? And what can be provided? And of course, not in a way in which we're disconnected from the rest of the world, because we're so connected now, right? But we have to do that at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, we could go on for another hour. We may have to come back again, because I'm really thinking of this as a series with some other persons as well, and there are quite a few people online who Rhoda Reddock, of course, P.I. Gomes, yes, and Roberta Kilkenny, who said she last saw you with Paget at Brown University some time ago. But let me put 2-3 quick things to you, Brian.
Yes.
One is coming out of what we have been talking about. One is clearly a need for us to transform. Well, you talked about the economy a lot, but transform as well our institutions of state. And I have posited an idea, which of course hasn't caught fire in Trinidad and Tobago, that the first Republican Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago of 1976 established the first republic, and that what we need to do is to evolve to the second republic, because essentially the institutions of that Republican Constitution are the old colonial institutions. It's the institutions that the British insisted upon, which was your statement about compromise at independence. And unless we transform the way in which transform our institutions so that people are involved in the process of decision making and not excluded, then we're going to continue to be in this situation where the state does not act in the interest of the majority, but acts in the interest of the minority who control economic power in the country. And so, that is one. The second one is the education system.
No, well, here. I mean, all I
Yeah,
can say is here. I'm with you 100% on board. The question is how do we do it? But before we ask the question how, we have to agree that we have to do it, right? Then we can work out the hows. Unless we bring
agreed.
the people, and we have the means to bring the people in ways in which back in 1962 we didn't have. You had Queen's Hall in 1962, and but now we have the internet. We have Zoom. We have all sorts of avenues that can actually bring the people at home and abroad. I call it in the Jamaican case a constituent assembly of the Jamaican people at home and abroad. But it's really a constituent assembly of the Caribbean people at home and abroad. Because when you get to Brooklyn, how are you going to prevent Jamaicans from coming in the Trinidad meeting? You can't. A, they are married to each other. B, that is how Brooklyn works, as in Carnival yesterday, right? Which was or 2 days ago, whenever it was.
Yes,
Is everybody
yesterday.
mix up? So,
Yeah,
but the Constituent Assembly of the Caribbean people at home and abroad is a slogan that we could conceivably consider moving towards as not just a mechanism to consult, but as a thing in itself worth doing. Sorry,
right.
that was your
No,
first point one.
no, well, actually, you answered point three, which really was about the new forms of social and political mobilization, if you wish, and the process by which we raise consciousness around these issues,
Yeah.
which is necessary to bring about change, because the change is not going to come from those who are in government or in the parliament, because they're not interested. They may say they're interested, but once they get there, they are quite comfortable with the systems that they operate.
It's too sweet. And then you can have
Yes,
a police that take you through traffic with the sirens on the I might,
flashing blue lights. Flashing blue lights is
flashing
what
blue
we call
lights.
it.
I mean, it's too
Yes,
sweet.
yeah,
Power. I remember one famous Jamaican politician whose name I won't call, who says being in opposition is a nightmare, right? Guess what? I've always been in opposition. I'm not living in a nightmare, but he's living in a nightmare because he no longer has the flashing blue lights and all
yeah,
of what that means, the accoutrement of power.
yeah. Yeah, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, speaking to his party people in the election campaign, said something similar, Dr. Rowley. He said, you move from this to nothing in the flash of a moment, one election day. That's it. So
But
he
nothing.
essentially said the same thing. Yeah,
But the notion of nothing, we're all nothing because 99.9% of the people are not in power. So we're all nothing, and that says everything.
yeah. Yeah, Dennis Panton, our late friend and comrade,
Of course.
in the Constitutional Reform Forum, which he started with a number of us, was making the point that we have to move from winner take all to all take win. That
Well
was one of
said.
the slogans. Yeah, that
Well
was one of his
said.
slogans.
Well said.
Yeah,
I didn't hear that before.
yeah. Dennis came up with that. Oh, that was 20 years ago.
Because he died a
Yeah,
while
time
ago.
flies.
Yes.
Yeah, more than 20 years ago. Yeah. So the last one I want to speak to is that of the education system, because I think the education system is one of the buttresses of our neocolonial status and condition. And Brinsley Samru, the late Professor Brinsley Samru, of course, who you knew well, also was, particularly towards the end of his life, was constantly speaking about the British ensuring pre-independence and going into independence that the political culture and the political system would keep the working class divided, and all the better to rule in terms of economic power. And so that has been a factor in Jamaica. In Trinidad, of course, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Trinidad it's race, and then of course Tobago versus Trinidad, as the case would be. In Jamaica, it's party tribalism, and you have elections tomorrow, and we perhaps will see some of that play out in Guyana. Same thing. There's colorism in the politics. There is patriarchy in the politics, and so on. All of those that keep us divided, and the education system helps to buttress and support that. So your comment about how do we, given that again the elites are not going to change the system because the elites benefit from it, and the children of the elites, including our children, all went to the best schools and so on, so they're not concerned about it. How do we get up, going back to the days of raising consciousness, which that was what people were involved in. But today, people are not so much involved in, and social movements, much weaker. The trade unions not doing the work of raising consciousness, and NGOs are what they are, not really social movements. So how do we once again get that sense, which I know you spoke about at the last part of your book in terms of hope, of reforming or reestablishing or strengthening, or whatever the right word is, the organizations of the people to engage in movement building, which is of course about raising consciousness and building power from below, and therefore counteracting what takes place in the formal process of education until we could get to that point where we could change it.
Well, David, there's no magic wand. There is hard slugging work. There is talking to people. There's frankly, and I must say this in front of you on your own program, the work you have been doing over a lifetime, right? Is not only commendable, but is precisely what is required. And not everybody can do what you do, and different people interact in different ways in the classroom, in the community group, on the street, in talking with people they do business with, in the marketplace or wherever it may be. But, no movement is made without a first step, or without a series of first steps. And, the work of slow education pays off, right? It pays off. And the truth of the matter is, if you think about, my book starts with the year 2019, when globally there was this upsurge of pro-democratic movements, spontaneous. They were spontaneous, but they were built on all of the dissatisfactions and the debates that have been going on in Chile, in Sudan, and then of course in 2020 in the United States there was the huge Black Lives Matter movement, which arose out of a single incident of police murder, on the back of many, many more before, but that one broke out. And again, the question is the work that had been done before in recognizing the totally unequal and brutal policing system. All of these things pay off in the end. And so the question is, there is no magic wand, but organizing and consciousness raising through the avenues, and organizing meaning movement building, you know, how you build a movement in the 21st century as opposed to how we tried to build movements in the 20th century is completely different. And movement itself will not look the same way. Right. But right now in the United States, you know, I'm up here in Rhode Island, and I'm seeing movement building happening here in its own peculiarly American way in the face of this horrific moment that we're living in. And there's no shortcut, there's no magic wand. It's slow slogging, but inevitable, I think.
Yeah, and as you talk about, you know, this horrible moment that we are living in, Stephen Howard, who's actually living in the US, made reference to what just happened in China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and that block that is emerging, not just BRICS, but more than BRICS in that Shanghai Cooperation movement. So there's going to be great contestation. There already is, and we've seen perhaps some of that play out in the Southern Caribbean as well. And one of the problems is of course the fragmenting of CARICOM, you know, which is happening and may further, depending on the elections tomorrow in Jamaica and what the outcome of the elections in Guyana, CARICOM may really be, and what, you know, the Trinidad and Tobago government is saying and doing, so that the US attacked a boat, which they claimed was a drug running boat. They don't, I don't know, they have no evidence of it because, of course, dead men tell no tales, and the boat has been blown up. So we don't know what was on it and what they were doing. And so there was no process of innocent until proven guilty. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago simply said, kill all of them violently.
Well, what we know for sure is that the United States government in its present constitution doesn't need proof to make wild accusatory statements about its own citizens in its own country, and even more so about events taking place in other countries. So you tell a lie, you repeat it oft, and then you act on that lie, as they have done, for example, in invading Washington, D.C., at a point when crime is decreasing. And you just keep saying, crime is increasing, things are getting worse, They need us there, they need us there. I don't think you convince the people in DC, but you convince your audience that you require for your daily fix. I don't know, at Fox, etc. But if they can do that in the United States, what will they do outside? You declare the government of Venezuela a rogue government, and you declare that they're drug runners. There's no evidence presented, and then you act. This is the dangerous times we're living in, and the extent to which any Caribbean leader would simply just jump into the fray and give assent to this. It boggles my imagination that you would be more careful and thoughtful in what you. Do you think it's going to give you brownie points in trade from a country which basically is now led by a government which thinks about itself and himself first before anything else? I think not. It's just a historical error of the greatest proportions.
Yeah, and on that note, which deals with the very issue that we're discussing in terms of independence and therefore of sovereignty and so on, you know, we're in trouble. And as we say the word sovereignty, always remember George Lamming, who both of us knew and worked with, always referred to sovereignty of the imagination.
Absolutely.
And that is, of course, one of the subtitles of your book, Memory, Imagination, and Hope. So, Brian, thanks a million for being with us this evening. My PR people tell me the program must not go for more than an hour. We've gone for an hour and 40 minutes.
Oh, wow.
But the time flew by. And I want to thank everybody who was live with us on Facebook. I'm not going to call everybody's name, but quite a few people joined us in the webinar as well. So thank you very much to those who joined the webinar. I know some people wanted to jump into the conversation in the webinar, but it was very difficult to, given the historical breadth and the current significance of our discussion this evening. So thank you to all who took part in the discussion one way or the other. And Brian, thanks a mil, and stay safe up in Providence, Rhode Island. And we'll certainly be in touch.
Absolutely, David. And thank you. And you stay safe too, and family.
Yeah. And as being a born Jamaican, I would say walk good.
Walk good. Walk good.
Walk good.
Take care.
Yeah, man.
Bye-bye
Okay.
now.
Bye.